two very eminent sociologists at AUD today. Professor Ari Sitas is at the University of Cape Town. He was I think, the Vice President of the International Sociological Association. And he's a performer, he's an artist, he's a poet, but he's also a sociologist. And he'll chair the session today. And Professor Michael Burroway is, the president of the International Sociological Association. He's worked for over 40 years now in various different contexts on industrial labor sociology. He already had a shorter session on that earlier. And he doesn't visit India very often. But when he does like to go to universities and talk to scholars and students like us. I want to just go ahead and, by the way, he's at University of California at Berkeley in the sociology program. So,
thank you. And the title is up there. Social movements in the age of neoliberalism. And we're going to ask you to speak for 40 minutes? 45. Okay. 45 minutes. And then there will be questions, debates, arguments, whatever we feel like. Now, we all know that social movements are these sustained absurges of people challenging class orders, political orders, the status quo, of whatever kind. But there is something unique happening in the world, I suppose, in the last, for me, 30 years, but perhaps it's shorter than that. And we're here to listen to Professor Burroway and debate with him about his ideas on what is going on in the world of movements.
Okay, thank you. Do you think you could come forward? All those who are coming late should be punished by coming forward. You can't sit at the back, it's impossible. I can't start until you're here. Impossible. These chairs have got to be filled. I've got to see your eyes. Very good. Very good. Okay. At the front. At the front, madame. This doesn't come on off my 45 minutes.
Oh, yes.
Okay,
44 minutes.
at the front, doesn't matter. Can you come to the front? Very good. All right. Well, I'm really very happy to be here. I'm very interested in what Ambedkar University is up to. I realize this is a new university. That means it's very exciting. And in fact, it was Rohit that first introduced me to Ambedkar University, walking around the University of Zambia campus. I don't know how many months ago. It sounds about 7 or 8 months ago. 5 or 6 months ago. And so I'm happy to be here. And I guess I'm going to talk about something that Ambedkar will be interested in, I think, in social work. I guess the title on here is Social Movements in the Age of Neoliberalism, and the title I gave to Ngala was New Social Theory for New Social Movements. Well, they're pretty well the same. I think we really do need a new social theory for the movements, and unlike Ari, who goes back, he's got a real historical consciousness, because not only a poet, a writer, a sociologist, he's also a historian. And I'm a pathetic sociologist, can't think for more than 2 years. So I'm going to talk about the last 2.5 years of social movements. Okay? And you can give that real historical depth afterwards. Yes, what I really want to do in the next few minutes, 40 minutes, is to try and link the social movements of the last 2 years to changes in the world economy. This is going to be very controversial. You're going to disagree with everything I say, and that's good, because as I said in the previous session, it's good to be wrong, and I hope we will have a discussion about social movements in different places. As Ari said, I think there's something going on in the world with social movements spreading across continents, and I would like to try and link it to the character of the economy, capitalist economy today. And I think the test is whether you can really see some of the social movements that appear not to be related to the economy, whether you can see it through the lens of the economy. And as you see, I think you can see this. This is something that may be familiar to you. This is the social protest movement around violence against women. This is the protest movement that occurred here in Delhi in December. And it's really quite, has been explosive. I mean, you may or may not know that this is really being watched and observed with great interest, all corners of the world. And as you can see here, there are these, I picked out 4 representations of this movement. One here is, I like this one, do not touch me, my dress is not a yes. So the idea of the expansion, and it's interesting that men, boys I suppose, men are shouting this, the expansion of the freedom of women. And here is another notion of freedom, hang the rapists, right? This is not an expansion of freedom, this is a contraction of freedom. So very different perspectives on the same social movement. And here we have, don't justify rape by blaming women, but of course is very relevant in the Indian context, where being raped is a dishonor to women and to the woman's family. So that's another vision of the idea of freedom being fought for. Freedom in this sense, freedom from the stigmatization of being raped. And then this last one, you can get raped, but not protest against rape. This is in a sense, a demand again for an expansion of freedom to protest. An attempt to address the state. I present these 4 images to underline how social movements are themselves internally divided, can represent different class interests, different gender interests. And the question is whether you can actually think about, perhaps we'll come to this in the discussion, whether one can think about this protest movement in the context of a changing economy. Can one actually pose the question, why, given the long history of rape in India, why now the social protest? And can one tie that to economic changes? I've just been in Jaipur, and I was very struck on 2 occasions. One was this literary festival there, and there was a musical performance by Chipla Rao, and Payon, a guy from Assam. Papon, thank you. And it was just amazing just to see the audience, how engaged they were. I mean, and then I was at the literary festival the next day, and how people were able to discuss publicly, again, young people discuss publicly this protest movement, because it was a very interesting, it was an American fellow called Michael Sandel, who came to the festival and to orchestrate. He's a philosopher, very well known, one of the most, perhaps the most well-known philosopher in the United States today. He wanted to orchestrate a conversation in the audience, about 1,000 people, about the moral issues around sexual violence against women in the Indian context, and he managed to do that. I was very impressed. I would be terrified to try something like that. But anyway, he managed to do that. But anyway, what struck me was the power of this new generation. And this new generation, this youthful generation, here has obviously been central to the protest movement, as it has been in so many protests around the world. Anyway, we'll come back to this later. But what I want to actually sort of go first, what I want to do is to actually briefly sort of remind you or alert you to the very different social movements that have taken place just over the last 2 years. And then try and give you an explanatory framework through which sociologists might understand them. And then see what are the implications of that framework. Okay, we will begin. Okay. Do you know what that is? Hmm? Yes. Now, where is this? Do you know? Anybody know where this is? Hmm?
Egypt.
Not quite Egypt, not far. Tunisia. This is December, I think it's December the 17th. Tunis, Bouazizi, the trader, self-immolates, molested, harassed by police, in a society that has in fact become, for which many people become in more and more precarious situation, economically precarious, and then harassed by the police, not able to sell his goods. So he self-immolates, and it is the spark that generates the Arab Spring. It is certainly the spark that generates a societal-wide movement in Tunisia against the dictatorship, Ben Ali's dictatorship. So, totally unexpected. As of course, you know, social movements very often break out in the most unexpected manner. Here, where is that? Tahrir Square, indeed. This is a massive mammoth, and all eyes were on Tahrir Square in the beginning of December of 2011. And this too was a societal-wide movement. People assembled, very importantly, in Tahrir Square, but also in squares in other cities in Egypt, struggling against the dictatorship, and indeed overthrew, like in Tunisia, overthrew a dictatorship, long-standing 30-year dictatorship of Mubarak. And was unheard of. You know, if we're going to call these Arab uprisings a revolution, it was a revolution in the mind of the subordinate population that actually dictatorship was not natural, inevitable, and everlasting. So it may not have been a revolution in the sociological sense of the transformation of society, and of course we see that this movement continues to this day, and how the movement and the state are continually in clash with one another. But nevertheless, if there was a transformation, it's a transformation of people's consciousness. Their sense of effectivity was transformed, which of course is the basis of their social movement. All right, that's Tahrir Square. I bet you won't get that one. Hmm? Very good, very near. It's just across the border. It's in Jordan, actually. That's Jordan, where actually there have been some very interesting, I'm using this because I just happened to have been there, and there are very interesting social movements, labor movements, Islamic movements have converged, and fascinatingly quite radical in some ways, but quite conservative in others, actually endorsing the monarchy, but perhaps wanting to change who is the monarch. To replace Abdullah II. But a very powerful social movement there in Jordan. Again, totally unexpected. Now this one. West Bank. Well, right. Yes, this is the West Bank. The Israeli state is trying to create settler communities, Israeli communities, that will divide the West Bank in two. And this would make the two-state solution completely impossible for the relation between Israel and Palestine. And so with great innovation, Sari was talking about social movements of great innovation. This is a movement of great innovation. It's incredibly difficult for Palestinians to actually move around the West Bank because of all the checkpoints. So what they did, they created themselves into a marriage party. And so they managed to get through the checkpoints on the grounds that they were going to a wedding. Well, they were actually going to set up these tents in protest. And of course, the protest in this case was actually carried by the media across the world. The Supreme Court said that protesters had to move, but the tents could remain. Israeli state took no notice of its own Supreme Court and just removed the tents. But again, you see a very imaginative social movement protesting, in this case, land expropriation, land invasion. India. So these are the special economic zones. Of course, if you actually look at these, there's amazing, as you all know too well, there are amazing protests around land expropriations for special economic zones. And if you look at a map of India, these purple triangles are all the special economic zones all over India, and most of them, as I understand it, have been paralyzed by social protest. So again, this is to do with land expropriations. India. This Very good, Wuhan. In China. No. What did you say? Oh, Gogan. No, not Gogan. No. Well, nearly, more or less. No, this is Wuhan, and this is in China. And this is again about land appropriations. I think the big story in China today is not in Beijing, it's not in Shanghai, it's not in Guangdong. It's actually in the rural areas that are being transformed through the land expropriations. And in this case, we have villagers or township dwellers who became, again, the focus of international attention, publicly protesting against the coalition of real estate interests and the party state, locally. So again, struggles around land expropriations. Aha! Aha! Anybody prepared to guess on this one? Spain. Very good, yes. This is real democracy now. I'm not sure whether this is Barcelona or Madrid. But again, these are social movements, 2011, beginning and continuing, against the austerity measures that are applied by the European Bank and by the Spanish state against the mass of the population that is under a major financial crisis in Spain, in large part because of the real estate boom and bust. And so austerity measures of all sorts, rising unemployment, the decline in welfare benefits that affect particularly the youthful population, whose aspirations and hopes for the future are being dashed. Yes. Well, Professor Sitas, tell us where this is.
Yeah, well, it's obvious.
It's in Greece. Yes, so this is actually a general strike, same response to austerity measures. People are really out there on the street, and we have to notice that in Greece there is both left and right protesting side by side. Well, not necessarily side by side, but at least the movement against austerity comes left and right. Okay, this is, let me read to you. Dear 1%, we fell asleep for a while, just woke up. Sincerely, the 99%. So this is the Occupy Wall Street movement. aimed at the 1%, the financiers that seemingly are dominating, running, organizing US society and beyond. The finance capital that Obama administration was supposed to contain but failed to contain, in fact, one could argue, consolidated. And these Occupy movements spread across the United States in many cities. In my own city of Oakland, there was a very militant Occupy movement that forged a close alliance with the labor movement that paralyzed the docks in Oakland and in other ports along the West Coast. You find Occupy movements all over the world, in Europe, in Asia, and Latin America. Everywhere I went in 2011, I could find some small group, and they were often very small groups at the center of cities occupying some central place. I don't know, was there one in Delhi? Anybody know of an Occupy movement here? No? No? Okay. We've got enough protest movements, don't need Occupy. Okay, all right. So that's the Occupy movement. Do you know what this is?
This is somewhere in Latin America.
Somewhere in Latin America. Very good. I heard it. Chile. Very good. There, what do we have is a student movement. An amazing student movement. Privatization of higher education in Chile and in other places has meant increase in student fees. What's different about Chile is that students don't expect to work in order to pay their fees. They expect actually their parents to pay the fees. In fact, the result is that civil society as a whole is implicated in the debts incurred by students. This is in fact a debt society. Despite the end of the dictatorship, there is continuing neoliberal laboratory there, neoliberal experiments that has generated a debt society of greater proportions than in virtually any other Latin American country. Though you will find in other Latin American countries students also protesting against privatization of education, but not to the extent in Chile. And Latin America, of course, like India, is a great continent of protest. Many of the protests in Latin America actually are against land expropriations and against the investments of foreign mining companies. But anyway, this is privatization of education, and I want to stress is that all these movements have been met with force, with violence. And this violence is obsessed with getting people away from public spaces that became the focal point for the movements. And I guess we could have, since Ari is here, we could have talked about South Africa and Marikana. And you know, the more you know about a social movement and society, the more complicated it gets. But you could still see that Marikana, the striking miners, striking against their trade union, and the repressive state, in which how many? I've forgotten now. 49. How many people were killed? 49. Oh, was it?
Yeah, 49.
49. Anyway, of that order, people were killed. I mean, but the protest, well, the emergent protest, can be seen as a part of the informalization, casualization of the labor process, the ever-increasing precarity of the working class's position, and the ever-increasing levels of inequality in South Africa. Okay, so those are just, the question is, can we actually say anything about all these movements, that they have something in common? Well, I'm going to try and make that effort to say they have something in common. We can make a statement about their distinctiveness, and therefore we can lay the foundations for a possible explanation of those movements. Okay, so let's see. I guess before I do that, let me just put them all together. First, the Arab risings, then there's land dispossessions, indignados, that's the struggles against the austerity measures, Occupy movement against finance capital explicitly, and then the student movement against privatization. you can see the way I've formulated this, with perhaps the exception of the Arab uprisings, that there is already, you can see, some linkages to economic factors. Well, we'll pursue that in more detail in a second. So these five sort of arenas, types of social movements, they're intersecting, connected to one another. They have on the one hand national specificity, but also there is a regional, in different regions there are different types of social movements. They are interconnected across the globe. So what are they? What do they have in common? First, they are national movements, but they're globally connected. National movements in the sense they are struggles in the framework of nation-states, national regimes, overthrowing dictatorships peculiar to specific countries, austerity measures peculiar to specific countries, privatization of higher education peculiar to specific countries. These are national movements, first and foremost, and globally connected. Second, is that there is what Zygmunt Bauman calls separation of power and politics. Behind these social movements is a disillusionment with the potentiality of liberal democracy to deliver social change, to offset rising inequalities, to contain finance capital. That electoral politics is incapacitated when it comes to the control of broader economic forces. That the state, rather than being accountable to electorates, is accountable to finance capital, to the interests of landed classes, to the interests of real estate speculation, but not to the electorate. Separation of power and politics. Power resides with the dominant classes, but in a sense controls the state, and politics is left for the people, but ineffective. And so, in a sense, these protests try and reconstitute the very meaning of democracy by talking about direct democracy, participatory democracy, prefigurative democracy, and rather than being connected vertical, it's connected horizontal. And many of these movements are seen to be leaderless. There are leaders, but they are not entrenched leaders. But they are people who emerge, but who are accountable through institutionalized mechanisms, accountable to their followers. Fourth, I think these social movements rest upon control of public space, as well as communication through virtual space. So public plus virtual space. People talk about the social movements being a reflection of the power of social media. Their social media clearly are important in making the connections, in making these movements possible, but without focusing on a public space that they control, I don't think these movements would have caught the attention and had the effect that they have had. And finally, repression. Repression is a characteristic these movements have aroused repression, particularly when they control public spaces. And these movements are incredibly flexible and inventive and recreate themselves in all sorts of new forms. They don't just go away despite repression. And I think we have to see that liquidity in a global context. They may disappear in one country, reappear in another country. There is a sensitivity to what is going on elsewhere. All right, that is what they share. And point number one is what they share is what, in fact, differentiates them, that they are nationally specific. Okay, so how do we think about this? Well, sociologists spend a lot of their time talking about social movements. In fact, that's one of the United States, this is one of the biggest businesses of sociology, is studying social movements. Basically, what has emerged in the United States is a mafia of sociologists who control the way you study social movements. And the strange thing is about the United States is that sociologists can't imagine why there could be really social movements. They know they exist, but it seems impossible because, in the United States, everybody thinks that the world is made up of individuals. And sociologists, therefore, think, well, how amazing it is that we have these social movements. And so they develop these theories of collective behavior. Now, these theories of collective labor have a universal character. The idea is to explain generally collective behavior. In the old days, they used to say that collective behavior was the result of was an irrational response to social change or social differentiation. That was the old. Are any sociologists here? Sociologists, stick up your hands. Any sociologists? Nobody wants to admit they're a sociologist. One sociologist. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What are you then? What are you economists? I should know who I'm talking to here. Economists? No? All right. Undecided. 1. Oh, I'm missing something. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm missing. All right. So what are economists, historians, anthropologists, business students? Development. It's all development. The answer is a real identity. Development studies. Oh, yes. Bit less hesitant. Why are you so hesitant? You haven't formed an identity. You never form a social movement unless you have more of an identity. Okay. All right. Well. All right. Sociologists. I'm still going to. It doesn't mean since there are so few of us here, I can insult them with impunity. Anyway, the American sociology I'm talking about. So basically, the old idea is that social movements emerge with their irrational responses to social change and social differentiation. And then people said, oh no, you need more than that. You need something called deprivation, but not absolute, relative. If you feel dissatisfied, then you're more likely to form a social movement. Then sociologists said, no, everybody feels dissatisfied. There should be social movements all the time. So that's not going to do. Then they started talking about resource mobilization. For there to be a social movement, yes, you need grievances, but you need to have resources to mobilize. You need to be socially connected. You need material resources, intellectual resources. And then people said, no, that's not good enough. And then they said, no, you need political opportunities, spaces in the political arena that make it possible for people to organize. And then they said, no, that's not. It goes on and on and on. They said, no, you've got to think about framing that basically there's a success and capacity of social movements is how they frame the meaning of the struggle. So there's an elaborate, like a research program around social movements. But what is interesting is that always the answers are of a universalistic character, applicable to all space and through all time. A general theory of social movements. And essentially, what is funny is that this universal movement is actually usually based on a very particular social movement, namely the civil rights struggle in the United States. The civil rights. And so basically they turn the particular into the universal. Yeah. All right. That's my little critique of American social movement theory. But European social movement theory, developed in the 1970s and 1980s, associated with Alain Touraine, talks about new social movements. They are movements, and here we're really getting something much more historically specific, associated with post-industrialism. That the old movements around labor are in a sense disappearing, and we have new identity movements associated with a period in which culture becomes more important and non-materialist values become more important. So this is the social movements of the 70s and 80s described by Alain Touraine and his students. The new social movement. Now this is great progress, seeing social movements in their particular historical context. But the historical context has changed. We now have a different historical context, and I would suggest to you the historical context is what I call third wave marketisation. And here we get to the point. And I'm going to use a fellow called Polanyi. I believe that social theory develops through the reconstruction of existing theory. Sometimes we start completely from scratch, but I believe we should actually start with theorists, at least begin with theorists that we have and reconstruct them. This fellow Polanyi, does anybody know this fellow Polanyi? 1, whoa, 2, 3, 4. Well, look, development studies, I don't care what you are, you've got to know Carl Polanyi. I mean, if there's anything you remember, write down the name, Carl Polanyi, Great Transformation. This is an amazing, brilliant book. It's canonical, and it needs to be reconstructed from the standpoint of India. I mean, you may say, no, don't take any notice of it because it is, in a sense, Europe-focused, but nevertheless, I think this book is an extraordinary book because it argues that basically if you push the market too far, there will be a reaction, a counter-movement, and it will be contained. But that counter-movement, Polanyi argues, writing in 1944, worried about fascism, worried about Stalinism. He says if that counter-movement against the market can expand freedom, but it can also reduce freedom. So Polanyi says you push the market too far, and you can likely to get fascist or Stalinist or totalizing dictatorships, as well as social democracy, New Deal. So basically he says, push the market too far, and there will be a movement against it, but there's no guarantee that that movement will be a progressive movement. Okay, well, I don't know what to do here. Let's see. So there we have response to market fundamentalism, social movements lead to counter-movements, but Polanyi missed. He missed the possibility, writing in 1944, that there will be another wave of marketization. He thought that humanity would never be so crazy as to actually experiment with another wave of marketization. And of course, what we have witnessed since the middle 1970s is indeed another wave of marketization. And we think of it happening in India post-1991, but it sweeps like a tsunami across the world. No country escapes third wave marketization. And I'd say there are three waves, that Polanyi missed the fact that his period from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century was actually contained two waves. And I'm going to draw this quickly, is that this is what I think is happening. So basically there is a first wave of marketization in the 19th century, and then there is a counter-movement in the 19th century, and the story he tells is the story of England, but you could tell it of other places in the world too, namely a movement against the expansion of the labor market, in particular in the 19th century, with the development of trade unions, the factory movement, cooperatives, and even a labor party, socialist party. Then you get another wave of marketization after World War I, that he collapses into the first one, that has to be, in a sense, distinguished, and then there develops, through the expansion of the market, particularly unregulated, well, not unregulated, but open trade, open international trade, organized around the gold standard. This generates crises of economic character in European countries, particularly countries like Germany, that turn to fascism to insulate the economy from the international trade that is actually creating such rampant inflation and crises in the Weimar Republic economy. And then, with this crisis, there is a counter-movement that actually involves the state. The state is the fulcrum around which the economy is regulated, whether it be the fascist state, the Stalinist state, the social democratic state, the Keynesian state, the New Deal state. It is the state that actually begins to contain the market. And then we get, post-74, the next wave. And the question is, what's going to happen? What is going to happen? We're in the middle of this wave. We think, for example, 1989. What was 1989? It was the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union. And this actually gave new energy to the market, suggesting that market solutions were the only solutions. Plans just didn't work. And then we thought in 2008, or some of us thought in the United States, 2008, the economic crisis, financial crisis, Obama is voting to power, Obama's a good guy, he will regulate the banks. No way. No way. He actually begins to try and tinker with the banks. There's a little bit more control, but essentially it consolidates finance capital, and third-wave marketisation continues on its merry way. Will it stop? I mean, the one thing that actually is threatening humanity, the planet, is ultimately an environmental catastrophe. And that is the result of the ever-expanding market. And the question is, even then, what will happen? Polanyi assumes that if you push the market too far, then there will necessarily be a counter-movement. But I don't think that we can depend upon that prophecy of Polanyi. There may not be a counter-movement. There may not be a counter-movement. And that the planet may, in a sense, dissolve. And there may be a counter-movement. It will have to be of a global character, but it may be of a progressive or a regressive. It may expand freedom, it may reduce freedom. So, insofar as it controls the market. So, we have to think in these, we have to think in these broad, historical, global terms. But how should we characterize the actual marketization? We've got these waves, and I'm suggesting here perhaps the movement was local, counter-movement was local, here it was state, and here it would have to be global, but we're not sure whether and how it will take place. But let's think about what this counter-movement has to engage, how to characterize this third-wave marketization. And here I want to refer, and again, I'm just trying to persuade you to a real Karl Polanyi, as I can't go into all the details here, but fictitious commodities and social movements. Polanyi said there were three fictitious commodities. He said that they were labor, land, and money. These are three factors of production that when you commodify them, when you subject them to unregulated exchange, then they lose their use value. So when labor is subject to buying and selling in an unregulated way, which labor has no support from social security, from welfare, unemployment compensation, when there's no regulation of labor relations with employers, then labor loses its capacity to labor. It loses its capacity to produce. Sometimes, in fact, what happens is that the labor is rewarded a wage that is lower than the cost of subsistence. So when the market is unregulated, the labor market is unregulated. And so we're facing ever more in the world today, and that's why, in a sense, one can say that India may be the image of the future as far as the working class is concerned, the informalization of the economy. 93% of the economy is informal, is in a sense unregulated. It is maybe the image of, because we see around the world, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Europe, United States, that the working class is ever more precarious, subject to loss of control. We used to talk about a proletariat, that is, wage earners who were exploited. Today, those wage earners are subject to commodification such that they cannot actually have a secure wage. And that precariousness is creeping up the socio-economic ladder, which explains why you have an Occupy Wall Street movement made up often of college graduates who can't find secure jobs. So there is a proletariat to a precariat, and I think the indignados are the particular protesters in Southern Europe who are facing precarious circumstances. We can talk about landless dispossession, which you know about here in India, but all of Latin America, of China, of Africa. Land dispossession has generated social movements of the landless, environmental movements concerned with the ways in which mining is appropriating land, introducing toxic waste, destroying water supplies. And indeed, we can talk about the commodification of water, as you know well, only too well in India. And one can talk about the commodification of air. After all, what is global warming? Global warming is precisely our threat to the planetary existence, result of the expansion of capitalism. And the solution is what? Well, the solution that we face today is carbon trading, which is none other than actually paying for the right to pollute. So capitalists, if they pay for the right to pollute, to generate carbon dioxide, to help further global warming, then it's okay. So marketized solutions to market problems probably don't work. But anyway, that's nature, the commodity. Then we have money, financial crisis, and one can see, in fact, that the financial crisis can be seen in terms of the generation. These derivatives and these loans are, in fact, new forms of money extended to people that generate debt. And debt is what we face all over the world, whether it's at an individual or at a national level. And the Occupy movement, in a sense, is part and parcel of the ever-increasing debt. And finally, we have another fictitious commodity that Polanyi never talked about, knowledge. And that's all about universities in crisis. Namely, it's all about privatization of higher education. Knowledge is no longer a public good, it's increasingly a private good that has to be bought and sold. Universities are in the business of somehow selling the production and dissemination of knowledge. You students will be paying increasing fees. The universities are increasingly becoming privatized, even in India. 50% of universities here are privatized, but it's happening all over the world. And universities are having to be self-financing. That means increased student fees, it means money from donors, it means money from research, and it distorts the character of the production of knowledge. Okay, dokie. All right. And the student movement, and there is a worldwide student movement, is against the privatization of higher education. And this is totally new. The 1960s student movement was not against privatization of higher education. No one was even thinking of the privatization of higher education in the 1960s. They were thinking about the bureaucratization of higher education, about the meaninglessness of higher education. But they assumed that university was essentially a public good. But no longer, no longer. So there is the fictitious commodity, and I believe that one can actually link the commodification of these entities, turning them into entities that can be bought and sold in an unregulated fashion, lies underneath the wave of social movements over the last 2 years and perhaps beyond. Okay, so this is my last 5 minutes I got left. So now what I want to talk about, so far I started with the social movements and tried to indicate how they may be linked to third wave marketization, may be linked to the fictitious commodities. Labor, nature, money, knowledge. Now I want to say, okay, suppose this theory has some validity. Let's start from marketization and these four fictitious commodities. What consequences shall we draw? Well, as I said, we moved from movements to marketization, and now I want to move from marketization to movements. So, first I want to draw your attention, when we talk about marketization, we have to really distinguish between two processes: commodification and dispossession. You see, if I want to sell my kidney, then it has to be forcibly extracted out of my body before it can be sold. And to make something into a commodity, whether it is land, whether it is labor, whether it is money, or whether it is knowledge, it has to be extracted from the social relations. This is a process of dispossession, and many of the struggles are really about the dispossession rather than the commodification itself. Commodification actually sometimes absorbs people rather than generating protest. It is the dispossession of people's access to land, to money, to security, that actually generates the protest. Second point is that we have to, as I insisted, that these movements have a national specificity, and in order to understand that specificity, we have to talk about the way the commodification of these different entities articulate with each other. In different countries, you have different combinations. You might say in India, there's a combination of land. Well, you probably got all four of them: land, money, labor, and knowledge. In some countries in Latin America, it's really much more about land and labor. In Chile, clearly, university knowledge is very involved. So we would look at different countries to see the articulation of the 4 types of fictitious commodity. And then third point is that these national movements, in a sense, are linked. They're not going to be linked in the old Marxian way by "you workers of the world unite," as if national boundaries didn't occur. National boundaries are there. So there's going to, in a sense, going to be an interlocking interrelationship among movements. If there is to be a global configuration of social movements, we cannot just simply jump over national boundaries or even local boundaries. So, finally, social movements and counter-movement. And this is the key question, right? Polanyi thought that a counter-movement that would restrain and constrain marketization would inevitably emerge. And the question is, do these social movements of the last 2 years, or if you wish, the last 30 years, do they add up to a counter-movement? That is the big question. Now, what do we see in these movements? We see multiple tendencies. We see this in the protest against sexual violence against women. We can see this in the environmental movement. Amita Babiskov, for example, has talked very interestingly about middle-class environmentalism in Delhi as compared with environmentalism that actually protects scheduled tribes' commitment and rootedness in land. So environmental movement brings together different class interests. So there are multiple tendencies in these movements, and some of the tendencies are actually pro-market as well as opposed to the market. So we have to really be very careful in making assumptions about the consequences of these movements. They have multiple consequences. Many people talk about how these movements begin with one agenda, but then that agenda is appropriated by other groups. People here in India or in Egypt talk about the ways in which right-wing as opposed to left-wing groups are able to turn movements in different directions. So we cannot be sure. What does that say? Grand conclusion or ground conclusion. Well, I got one more item here, multiple consequences, and the grand conclusion is this. It's a question. Do these social movements, can we conceive of these social movements as acting as a counter-movement, regulating third-wave marketization? Or are these social movements the vehicle through which third-wave marketization continues to spread? Very often resistance to capitalism is appropriated by capitalism to advance its own interests. So that is the big question. We cannot assume that this wave of movements is going to be that counter-movement. And the grand conclusion is we as social scientists, all of us in this room, have in a sense a responsibility to give vision to these movements. They are at the moment, I think, quite localized, connected, but I think the university is one place where, and particularly Ambedkar University, given its legacy, is one place where one can create visions that will actually link movements to an agenda, a vision that emerges through dialogue between social scientists and social movements. And on that note, I'll leave you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now let's start the discussion. I will take 4 questions or comments and then we respond and we go back. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
You showed us 4 pictures from the latest. I mean, it's not directed at those. But I was just curious how you're you've got a theory about these movements becoming either counter forces to marketization or enabling marketization. And I might have missed it in your talk, but I was curious to understand how you're linking this latest social movement that Delhi kind of witnessed over the last month to the theory that you share with us. Thank you.
Hi, Michael. You spoke about new social movements and you compared it with the collective behavior approach of American sociology. And somewhere in between, there is this approach which has got hidden, which comes from the tradition of scholarship, which has been studying social movements in Indian context, and which has also termed its horizon as new social movements. For example, Neoliberalism talks about the new social movements of the South, and where she's taking her stance from Rosa Luxemburg and Gramsci to talk about the issue of addressal of culture, that the peasants, the Dalits, the women actually take up, particularly in the 1970 period. And she links it to the concept of primitive accumulation and how, and let me remind you that we are talking about globalization and the rise of global capitalism today. Most of these new social movements, theorists of India, have treated global capitalism at that point of time, in 1970, also as global. So how primitive accumulation is not just a kind of phenomena which exists in the rise of capitalism, but also carries it with itself. And if you look at it from that angle, probably issues of Dalit, issues of peasants, particularly in Indian context, would be far more different from issues of labor that is addressed by most of these social movements. So I would like to have some comments over this.
Right.
Sir, my question is about the consequences. Do you think there's a latent danger of marginalization in these new social movements? For example, let's say people protest, people choose a specific place. For example, in Jantar Mantar or India Gate, we don't see people protesting near their university or other places. I mean, that becomes a sort of, like people reside. It's also about experiencing democracy. You don't get to see those protests happening right in front of your houses. You don't feel part of the city sometimes. And also recently, the first day when there was a protest against the recent gang rape, I was there and I was thinking that there would be many from the Northeast. I mean, having known that they are also regular, they are victim of regular sexual harassments. And I was surprised that there were hardly anyone there. And I thought, is this because they don't identify yourself? I mean, people don't notice what's going on, because there have been many instances where girls from the northeast part have been raped, but there have never been voices regarding them. I mean, not in such scale. But I'm absolutely for this kind of protests happening. But I also felt that this produces marginalization. You push them even further into the margins with this sort of movement. Is there a danger in that?
Sorry.
I have two questions. I'm hearing about. Could there be a confluence between movements which are explicitly against market fundamentalism and movements which are based on identity politics? And the second question is, are the new social movements a response to a reproduction of an alien space in a different geography? And is there a tendency for it to, let's say, turn reactionary?
Sorry, can you just say that?
Second question.
Yeah.
Are the new social movements a response to the reproduction of an alien space in a different space? And, I mean, can it turn reactionary?
What do you mean by alien space?
In the sense that something which is very particular to a certain space, like neoliberalism in USA, gets implemented in India at the same, I mean, that kind of a blueprint, in that sense. I mean, the new social movements, is it a response to that?
Can you respond and then yeah. You go first for the second round. Okay. Michael?
Whoa. Yeah. Well, yes. Well, let's begin at the beginning. How might one think about? How might one think about protest against gang rape in terms of this scheme? well, one can think about, I mean, I think one has to pose the question, why now? Why in December we had this protest when, of course, there have been many other cases, and public cases, of violent assaults against women. And the question is whether you can link it to, for example, the idea of people wanting to actually appropriate the city. Right is called in the discourse, geographical discourse, the right to the city. Whether in fact, you know, the protest was all about that we want to control. It's beyond the actual gender issue. It's a matter of we want to control our city. And in a sense, this is all about land expropriations and land appropriations. Is it about clearly a lot of the protest was against the state. Is it about the relationship between the state and economic forces? Is it about the unaccountability of the state to the interests of people in the city? So each of these sorts of explanations goes beyond the actual gender issue. And of course, that's why one's on tricky ground. But one has to explain, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts about this, one has to explain why now? Why now? Is there something about the unleashing of the energies of young people against the traditional norms that are now incompatible with a modern consumerist society, modern market society? I don't know. I would love to hear some of your thoughts.
Do you think it's perhaps just feeling encouraged from what they see around the globe?
Yes.
Simply that?
Yes, I'm resistant to diffusionist ideas. Clearly that is a factor that is empowering people everywhere. But I think the question is whether, and this is a difficult case, and one can make. I'm not suggesting that every social movement can be explained in these terms, but I'm suggesting that if you have a framework like this, you want to try and make an effort, and that's my effort. Now there may be, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. One can put some balance of explanation to precisely that social movements are of the era. There is a wave of social movements, but I'm not yet satisfied with that. What is happening in Delhi, what is happening in India to actually lead to a protest of this extraordinary mammoth character that is of almost as revolutionary as any of these other movements? You want to help me?
Michael, I have a different question altogether. But I think, for the last 50 years, the Dalit movement has been asking this question of public, atrocities, discrimination that is made against Dalit women, and which has not caught the eye of the middle classes of this country. But certainly, this particular rape incident has, why this particular rape incident has caught the eye of the middle classes. What I see distinctive in this particular movement is the middle class urban phenomenon.
Can we?
No.
This is a new question.
Well, it's the same sort of question around this movement.
Okay.
Is it okay if we have a little bit of discussion about this movement? No?
Okay, can you answer the others
No?
and then we come back to it?
All right. But somebody had to have, well, let me just hear one other
That is
person.
also mine.
Hmm?
I mean, the other question also comes from me regarding the new social movement.
Yeah. All right, your boss.
Okay,
all right.
Please respond to.
Okie dokie. All right, second. I'm trying to be accountable to the people, but here he is, Bolshevik dictator, sit down. Yes, the second question, I'm sorry, I'm very bad at this. I mean, I've forgotten which face belongs to which question. But anyway, this question about primitive accumulation. Yes, there is a theory widely circulating today in the world, and clearly in India it started before it received its currency in the West, namely that capitalism consistently, continually requires processes of dispossession. And the old idea of Marxian idea of dispossession was that in order for there to be capitalism, you have to dispossess the peasantry of access to the land so they become wage laborers, and so they have to therefore sell their labor power to a capitalist. And it happens as a genesis of capitalism. Rosa Luxemburg comes along and says, no, this is not just a genesis, that this dispossession of the laboring class continues throughout capitalism. It is a continual process of dispossession of landed peasantry that is the foundation of capitalism. And David Harvey, the geographer, continues with his argument about accumulation through dispossession. But they are largely talking about land dispossession. Now, what I'm suggesting here that there are these other types of dispossession too. So I'm talking about land dispossession, and I'm talking about also the dispossession of the working class of access to means of its existence. So basic welfare rights, basic security, the guarantees of employment. I mean, these guarantees, and of course, in a sense, India there is a slight counter movement against that in India. But in many places in the world today, labour is actually losing its right to labour. And indeed, today one can say that exploitation is a privilege of ever shrinking number of people, as in fact insecurity in the working class. So that's a dispossession of labour from access to basic security. Then there is dispossession of people from access to public knowledge. That is what's happening in the universities. And one can talk about the financial markets as also being, in a sense, disembedded from the national context and moved to a global context. So I think there's a multi-dimensional process of dispossession, which I don't think people have talked enough about. Yes. Right. Yes. Well, that's right. Protest in the city. And whether this protest can actually lead to marginalization. There's somebody over there, right? Yes. Yes, I think that protest in the city can lead to social movements being marginalized, but I think what is distinctive about this epoch of social movements, the last 2 or 3 years, is they're not their marginalization, but their connection with one another. So I think that because we, in a sense, there's a wave of social movements, that they are indeed connected to one another, and that, in a sense, prevents that marginalization. Though there are always groups that are trying to steer these movements in different directions, these movements are themselves terrains of struggle everywhere. And you can see this daily, for example, in Egypt, where the movement moves one way or another according to the balance of power. Yes, and then, all right. Yes. Now, I haven't really got this. Can you just, what was your question again?
My first question was, can there be a confluence between movements against the market and movements for identity politics?
Ah, yes, right. Yes, well, that's the million-dollar question in a sense, is how does one link the two? Many of these movements are in fact around identity politics, and in fact mutually generate identity politics. They are, in a sense, movements can be responding to one another. And the question is whether there is some underlying forces that are generating that energy in the first place to do with third wave marketisation. What this requires is careful, ethnographic examination of these social movements and to see the connections between the two. I've chosen movements where the connection seems to be relatively clear. The question is whether you can extend it to other social movements. Right, yeah.
Thank you. 1 question is here. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. I've got 2 that I'm holding back. Yes.
Shall I say? I have a couple of questions. As a sociology student, we are always confronting about social movement. What is a social movement? That is a fundamental question in sociology. So I would like to know from you that, see how you are differentiating a social movement from a protest and an agitation, etc., etc.
From political movement?
Yeah, from a social movement. Yeah, it's also a political thing, from a political movement.
Social movement from a protest.
From a protest, an agitation, a political movement, etc.
Okay, what? Yeah, all right.
Then the other thing, are you using new social movement as a descriptive category in order to explain these movements, or is it something any connection or link with the new social movement theory which was originated in the Europe in late 60s and early 70s? And also, I am also interested to look at how caste, especially in India, how caste, and gender got structured in movements. That because he was trying to pose that questions in a different manner, especially when we talk about all these kinds of movement in the last 2 years.
So I have two questions. One is about, so most of the social movements are about gathering a majority. That is when we talk about a movement happening, a change being coming in. But that's what at least I have witnessed in India, in Indian movements, is what happens. It's about a herd mentality, but not a consciousness getting created. It's a mentality, there's a protest going on, there are students, there are people coming out on the streets. But it eventually dies down in a couple of days. The consciousness of change, the realization of something wrong has happened does not sustain or does not get even created. So how effective are these social movements in terms of these boundaries, these hierarchies that are in depth created in the society? And second is, mostly the social movements end up benefiting the political parties in one or the other way. Whenever, even in the recent case, in the recent Delhi rape case, we saw people talking about Congress should get down, they're not able to run the country, and so on and so forth. So one or the other political party stands up and takes the benefit of the social movement, and eventually it becomes a part of the political power being played out in the larger forum.
So my question is connected to some of the themes that were raised in the previous session. So especially the comment with regard to whether what we have witnessed in Delhi in December was a middle class response agitation. So my observation is that most movements get critiqued around what somebody raised, questions of identity, that this is the middle class movement, or say the queer movement has been criticized as being elite, a movement by the rich. Similarly, even the Dalit movement, some of the movements have been criticized as downplaying gender differences, and so on and so forth. The women's movement has been criticized on grounds of not taking significant account of heterogeneity, and so on and so forth. So my question is that often responses occur with regard to identity and are often used to downplay the significance of any movement. So how do we take up these critiques within a larger framework of the politics of movements, and can these eventually downplay the significance one accords to any social movement?
Yes, sir. I was just trying to place Burma in the context of what you spoke about at the end, where you said that there needs to be a dialogue between social sciences and social movements. And if you take the case of Burma, what has happened is that I'm particularly trying to think of, if there is a misplacement of social commitments with the ideas of freedom. Because the movement in Burma was, Aung San Suu Kyi and the whole student movement for democracy has been going on for a long time. And now that they have got a little leeway with the democratic freedoms that they're supposed to get, you also see this neoliberalism entering Burma and trying to get hold of the society there. So social movements in itself is getting translated into neoliberal voice. So what I'm trying to say is that is the idea of freedom becomes identified with the availability of Coca-Cola, because they just recently started bottling Coca-Colas in Burma and they were very happy about it. Or is the availability of Coca-Cola a prerequisite for such kinds of freedom to be exercised in the first place? Thank you.
I was just wondering if, I'm not sure about the appropriateness of this question in this context, but I was just trying to
a little bit bold. I was just wondering if your explanation could be, pushed back by a step. So, for example, what explains this wave or tendencies of commodification in the first place in the present society? And I was wondering if this has anything to do with the degrading, moral fabric of the society as such. If you and can one reasonably think in that direction, and if one could, then what explains this degradation of some kind of, I'm not necessarily talking about the religious moral order, of course Michael Polanyi kind of argued about that, but some kind of degradation of moral fabric.
Okay, thank you very much for all these questions. I'm writing them down. I will think more about them. But yes, what's a social movement? What's a social movement? Well, a social movement, as compared, a protest, I'm not in the business of actually legislating what a social movement is. I will have a flexible understanding of what it is. But it has a certain longevity and continuity that often protests don't. So I think the longevity, its durability, is an important feature of a social movement as opposed to a protest or an agitation. I think that when you ask about new social movements, am I referring back to the new social movement theory of the 70s and 80s, associated with Alain Touraine and others? I am in a sense, because what that new social movement theory did was to recognize the importance of context, political, cultural, ideological context, and I think that is absolutely crucial if we are to understand the specificity of each individual social movement or configuration of social movements today. So I was not searching for a general theory in the way that they did in the 1950s. So the new social movement theory, I just think that the overall characterization of that context as post-industrialism is really not appropriate to this present era, that we have to talk about what I call this third wave marketization. So that's that question. And yes, how can class, caste, gender, structure, well I don't think there's any sort of broad general claim that can be made about how class and gender and caste are structured into social movements. That has to be examined. The claim I'm making is that underneath that, that explains the wave of movements at the moment, there is a linkage to third wave marketization. That's the claim. How that third wave marketization expresses itself is something that is, in a sense, indeterminate and has to be understood in the particular context. Well, my claim is that we can actually see the workings out of the market in these movements, but it works itself out very differently in different places. And so you're absolutely right. Any sort of social movement often has these different strands, and they are often conflicting strands around caste, around class, around gender. And we have to take that out. So we have to be studying social movements probably more carefully than we have. We need to be actually recognizing their multiplex character. And so I think, we need to spend time with social movements and participate in their evolution and see. And this comes to the other question about the way political parties indeed are on the lookout all the time to appropriate these movements. And that's precisely, in a sense, why these movements so often are so concerned to distance themselves from politics as usual, from electoral politics, and in distancing themselves from one another. So, for example, Occupy Wall Street, there was a huge attempt by the trade union movement to take it over. And they were militantly opposed to this. So they retreated and refused to let the trade unions enter into the movement. But this meant that they were, in a sense, more localized, and it incapacitated them some. So in resisting the apparatus of political parties, of the institutions of civil society. In resisting them, they actually limited their capacity to fight. And everybody criticized them precisely because they had no agenda. But it's because they were trying to avoid being taken over by political parties. So they recognized precisely the problem, where it intensifies the dilemma of their power and whether they can actually therefore constitute themselves as a common set of movements across the globe that has the same understanding that they want autonomy from electoral politics and the institutions it elaborates. And it's very difficult. So it's a really difficult dilemma to be faced with. Yes, right. Yes, middle class movements. I'll read my own. These various identities, not to, in a sense, repress the identities, but somehow accumulate the identities into a much broader vision. And I think that behind these movements is the character of capitalism today. And so that's the bigger vision that can actually give a place to all the identities, whether it's caste, whether it's gender, whether it's class. But that is indeed what happens, is that movements are critiqued as being particularistic. And the claim is, can you have a meaningful notion of a universalistic movement? That's the question you're posing. And I suppose that's really what's behind my endeavor here, is that if we're going to talk about the universalism today, it's a capitalist universalism. It's a universalism that has to be seen in the context of capitalism. That can indeed see the way that the market is actually shaping all these identities. So that's the claim, but in the reality of, as you say, of movement politics, is that they tend, and this perhaps was the issue of the fragmentation and marginalization, that they tend to be subject to easy critiques from different dimensions. And we've got to somehow combine those dimensions. But we need still a bigger framework. And we have to have a vision of where we are going that will embrace all. And I think that capitalism is leading to the destruction of the planet. And insofar as we have a common view of this, and insofar as that's tenable position, then we have a standpoint from which we can bring together all these movements. Yeah. Okay. Burma. I know nothing about Burma. But I can say this, that, it's a similar story in many struggles against dictatorship. That the struggle, and we can talk about Libya, we can talk about Egypt, some people talk about Tunisia, the struggle against a dictatorship by social movements can often give rise to a world that is unfree, perhaps almost as unfree as the dictatorship itself. I witnessed this myself in the fieldwork I did in post-Soviet Russia, where the population engaged in a struggle against the party states that represented the Soviet Union. And they engaged in a struggle that was, in a sense, was definitively pro-market. They thought that markets would liberate. And so they embraced markets. And I remember the mine workers I used to spend a lot of time with in northern Russia. They were incredibly militant and courageous against the party state. And then they were trying to concoct a whole new vision of a post-Soviet market society. And they did so. But they were the first people to be sacrificed in the post-Soviet era. They were the ones who actually thought they would own the mines, they lost the mines. And so the market became a second prison. They thought that they were going to get out of prison, but they entered another prison. So indeed, that is the dilemma, that often, and many of these struggles against dictatorship turn out to be a commitment to a project that imprisoned people all the more. Then the question is whether there will be a second round of engagement and critique. I think that is what is happening in Latin America. The struggles against dictatorship delivered electoral democracy, which then converged with neoliberalism to generate a whole social movement and insisted on the importance of the deepening of democracy. Many interesting experiments about the deepening of democracy in Latin America spring from the critique of the market that actually, in a sense, imprisoned people in the post-dictatorship world. So, and Polanyi, interesting enough, says that basically the working class in England in the middle of the 19th century will only rebel once it has actually been subject to the market. That is a condition for total rebellion. I'm not totally convinced, and the historians certainly are not convinced that that is the story of the rebellion or the revolt of the working class in England. But nevertheless, that was his argument, that basically only when the market is pushed really far will there be this response. Yes.
Coming to what you're saying, I think that the knowledge production in itself has to, we have to think whether the knowledge will actually lead to this alternate viewpoint, like you said in Latin America, or will it lead to something that is happening in India? So, how are we producing knowledge? I think that is also a very difficult question.
Yeah, these consequences are not determinate. So we have to get away from the idea, this is very tempting, that social movements against the restriction of freedom are necessarily liberatory. That's tough. And the last question that somebody asked me about there, I guess, right. Yeah, it's a very good question. I've formulated slightly, where do these three ways come from? Why do we have these three ways of marketization? I think for that you need to have a new theory of accumulation of capital and the crisis that capitalism generates. So, and I don't think that Marxists today have actually developed a sufficiently, not at least have paid sufficient attention to the market and the way the market moves in waves. So we need a theory of capitalism and its historicity that actually allows us to understand how these waves develop. Why a wave developed in the 1970s? Some people think it was because basically capital had lost power and the working class in the West, because that's where it came from, the working class had gained too much power. This was a reaction by capitalism using the market to dispossess the working class. I'm not as happy tonight with these class struggle arguments. I think we have to have a theory of capitalism that recognizes how these waves emerge and how they are responded to. We need to have a Marxism for the 21st century.
And we've got the possibility of 2 or 3 brief questions. We're running out of time. 1, 2. Fine, 2, fantastic.
You're very intimidating, fellow.
So, I am Nidhi. So, as you were talking about certain situations where laborers are losing their right to labor. So, some of them have formed organizations and they're protesting for their rights. So, in this situation, it becomes, and it's felt that a need for a change becomes a necessity for them for their survival. So in this procedure or in this process, how do their aims and objectives take forms and how do they change?
Yeah, actually I was just going to say something about the whole middle class thing. It seems to me to be this sort of the most overused but also under-theorized concept in India right now. I don't know how to put it, but it's like the middle class is to India what US is to the world. So in a sense, we don't really believe it's going to do any good in the world, but we still appeal to it. We say, oh, why isn't US looking at Libya? Well, why isn't US doing this, talking about Sudan or Darfur? And similarly, that point about why did the middle class look at all these things in Chhattisgarh or elsewhere? But we need to be clear about what it is and what its place in India is. And to the extent that people are protesting, why isn't middle class protesting about rapes elsewhere? Well, one could easily turn it again, the other way around too. Why aren't, let's say, villagers protesting about something that's going on in the city? One can turn that argument the other way. Why aren't villagers, rural India, protesting about what's happening in the city? So that's, I think, not the way to go. People protest, your consciousness is related to your own experiences. But in the middle of these protests, people were in Delhi making claims, arguments about the Northeast, Kashmir and so on. So it did enlarge the view of the protesters.
They were making claims.
about people were broadening this argument to include also people from Northeast.
Sexual violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like they were raising the issue of misuse of armed forces special power act in Kashmir and in Northeast. So it was logically articulated in a very broad manner rather than marginalizing many of those rape cases which occurred before this.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Grand conclusion.
You're you're into real grand things of grandeur.
General theory of.
That's my problem. I know. Yes. All right. Yes, the informal workers. I mean, or the informal, the declining right of workers to actually establish conditions of their own viability, sustainability. I mean, I read recently a book on informal workers in India, who workers that essentially, don't have the leverage that the old working class had, in 19th century, even 19th century England, 20th century Europe, even, in the formal sector in India, that basically what is happening is that workers no longer, the threat of a strike today, so quickly, so it was the main vehicle for working class power, is now actually turned very easily into a lockout. Workers strike. Capitalists say, okay, fine, we'll lock you out, we'll employ other people because there is an enormous surplus of labor, and we will actually introduce all sorts of informalization and casualization. So the leverage based on actually the workers vis-a-vis capital is declining. And so where might informalized workers, casualized workers, contractualized workers, where might they exercise some power? Well, this person argues, Rina Agarwal, that is actually in the political sphere, that actually in certain states in India, where there is competition among parties, that informal workers, once organized collectively, can exercise some power in the political arena. Which in a sense goes against what I've been saying here, which is basically to say that the political and democratic arena is not a viable place for exercising and developing one's rights. So it's clearly has to be more nuanced. I mean, to me, I mean, I've only been here a few days, but the legislation, the RTI, the RTE, the guaranteed employment, these are, I mean, in the world context, quite extraordinary pieces of legislation that go along with, on the one side, an emergent neoliberalism and a coercive state when it has to be. So it's an interesting combination, but there is some space there. So in a sense, we can't neglect it. But the danger is what you say. If you enter the space, then you may actually find yourself no longer in control of your movements. But anyway, this is the dilemma, that social movements around workers are becoming less and less powerful. What I'm suggesting is that they have to, in a sense, form coalitions with other groups that are, in a sense, subject to dispossession in different ways. Yes, and then the middle class. Oh, crumbs, the middle class. Well, first of all, first step is that there are middle classes. And this is what you should be doing here. Back to university, should be figuring out what the middle. I mean, I've witnessed in the last week so many conversations about what the middle class is. I mean, I am clueless what the middle class is in India. I mean, you're right. It's a rhetorical tool that is invoked under all sorts of circumstances, and I am completely confused. So I would really love you to help me on this one. I mean, my friend Eric Olin Wright, we're the last two Marxists, sociological Marxists in the United States. I mean, he's made a career on figuring out what is middle about the middle classes. And if you look at his scheme, it's going to be of not much use to you. So, I mean, I think we have to, again, rethink, and perhaps we should banish the term middle classes. Let us struggle to figure out, what's really happening, and who is really protesting, and with what vision, which comes to this idea of broadening and embracing different parts. And it's another way of thinking about social movements. Are social movements things that sort of contract over time, or can they be expansive? And can they embrace, in a sense, more identities? And my last grand conclusion is this. as an orthodox Marxist, one tends to think that the defining experience of struggle revolves around production, revolves around exploitation. That is the old Marxism. And I argue, with the help of Polanyi, that the important experience today, when it comes to the development of social movements, is not around exploitation and production, but is around commodification in the market. So that is the experience that is, in a sense, a visceral experience that has behind so many of these social movements. But just because we all share this experience of the market, this dispossession, you might say, around labor, land, money, knowledge, does not mean we have any unity. There may be this common experience may turn out to be very fragmentary. Can we create an imagination that will propel a unifying thing is, I suppose, important, unifying social movements that does not fragment and marginalize, but actually builds on this wave? And I think that is sort of the embryonic consciousness of so many of these social movements, searching to try and be embracing as many identities as possible. And I think behind it is the experience of the market and not of production. So I'm happy to entertain other dimensions too, but I mean that's where I would put my money. But I think as social scientists, we should be in the business of trying to configure new social theory. That's what it's called, new social theory for new social movement. We have to be in the business of figuring out new social theory and in fact a form of social theory that can, in a sense, be for social movements, not just about social movements. A theory that develops in dialogue with social movements. We still have a role to play even as the university gets privatized. And I know here at Ambeka you will never let that happen to you anyhow. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to bring this dialogue to an end. And let's hope that we meet again very soon and we'll have all the answers by then. And the theories. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks also to Ari for sharing the session. Thanks, of course, for
Good luck.